Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in freshman English, and we now turn to page 694, 695 and following. We're going to be working with Ernest Lawrence Thayer's Casey at the Bat. This is one of those really famous poems in American poetic history. Before we get there though, I just want to point out that we now begin poetry collection number 5, where we're going to look at 3 poems together: Casey at the Bat, William Stafford's Text 15, and Sandra Cisneros' Twister Hits Houston. We're going to be concentrating, however, together on the issues of narrative poetry, telling stories through poetry of different kinds. And on page 694, notice we've got the big question, how does communication change us? And we've got some vocabulary at play here. Let's learn a little bit about Ernest Lawrence Thayer really quickly on 695. Note your dates, 1863 to 1940. It's not surprising that Casey at the Bat reads like a sports story in verse. The poet, Ernest Lawrence Thayer, worked for many years as a sports reporter on the staff of newspapers in New York and California. One more time we're meeting a writer who comes out of the background of journalism, right? Casey at the Bat first appeared in the San Francisco Examiner, write it down, 1888. So we are looking at a poem of a good number of years ago, right? Okay? It became so popular that in 1953 it inspired an operetta called The Mighty Casey. Now let's say 2 things about this text before we get started. 1, earlier when we were talking about the analysis of baseball, the Mace Swenson piece, earlier when we were talking about rules of the game, the text from Trailer Club, we pointed out that you need sometimes prior knowledge to appreciate certain texts. For example, the Amy Tan text, you got to know a little bit about chess. In analysis of baseball, for example, we said it helps to know a little bit about baseball. The same will be true here for Casey at the Bat. Okay? Number 2, this is what we call a narrative poem because it will describe a story. So write that down. I'm going to ask you 2 questions at the end of our reading of this poem. 1, what is described? Literally, what is described at level 1? First this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Okay. And then secondly, I'm going to ask you this question. Where is the tension, the conflict tension in this text? Okay, we said that all great stories have a certain kind of conflict. What is the conflict in this text? Let's turn now, 6, 9, 7, and just read along with our reader and try to answer those 2 questions.
Casey at the Bat by Ernest Lawrence Thayer. It looked extremely rocky for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 2-4 with but an inning left to play. So when Cooney died at second and Burroughs did the same, a pallor wreathed the features of the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go, leaving there the rest with that hope which springs eternal within the human breast. For they thought if only Casey would get a whack at that, they'd put even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, and likewise so did Blake, and the former was a puddin', and the latter was a fake. So on that stricken multitude a death-like silence sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and the much-despised Blakey tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and they saw what had occurred, there was Blakey safe at second and Flynn a huggin' third. Then from the gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It rumbled in the mountain tops, it rattled in the dell. It struck upon the hillside and rebounded on the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And when responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then, when the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance glanced in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches, black with people, there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of the storm waves on the stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone on the stand. And it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He made the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike two!" "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, "Fraud!" But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let the ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel vengeance his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out.
Now, in the history of sports in America, and again, we were talking about this with the analysis of baseball, there's always been this debate about why it is the case that baseball is such an important element in American history. Many have argued it has a lot to do with this poem. So let's try and explain why this is such an important poem in the history of the American psyche, especially as it relates to sport. Because early on, I mean, think about that, 1888, right? So 1988 is 100 years later. So you got a whole 100-year century where this poem is read by every school child in school, okay? Everybody knows this poem. And while it may be a new poem to you, and might seem a little bit old-fashioned, for a very long time in American thought, this was the poem of all poems. When you talked about sport, this was the poem. In fact, I have known older people who, when they were children, memorized this poem. I kid you not. They memorized this poem. I've had freshmen that are like, memorize this poem? Of all the poems, for example, that we've studied, this poem? Why? I think there's a couple of reasons. Let's list them. One, this is a poem which draws heavily on the ancient Homeric tradition of Odysseus. Now, we're going to talk about Odysseus in our freshman English class when we do Homer's Odyssey. Who is Odysseus? Let's go ahead and say it out loud. I'm sure you probably have some sense of it already from earlier comments we've made. Odysseus is the greatest Greek hero. What makes him a hero? He goes through all kinds of terrible adventures, exciting adventures, dangerous adventures, and at the end of it all, he's still left standing. In the middle of the fight, however, he never loses his cool. And of course, Odysseus becomes the penultimate example of the quintessential hero, the one who stands in the middle of the fight and has a certain kind of look on his face. Let me give you an example. The great giant monster, Polyphemus, one-eyed Polyphemus, a huge guy. He's eaten a couple of Odysseus' men, and he says to Odysseus, you, I'm going to eat you last. What's your name? And Odysseus smiles, we're told in the text at him. He smiles at him, and he goes, oh, my name is Nobody. Well, Nobody, I'm going to eat you. Later, when Odysseus and his men figure out a way to blind Polyphemus with his one eye, they shove a sharpened telephone pole into his eye and blind him because they get him drunk. Polyphemus screams to his brothers who are standing on the outside of the cave, I'm blinded, I'm blinded. They're like, who blinded you? And he says, nobody blinded me, nobody blinded me. And we're told that Odysseus laughs or chuckles that he got one on the big monster. Now, when you're a person listening to a story like that, what are you supposed to learn? Heroes never lose their cool in the battle, right? That's what makes them heroes. Number 2, Casey at the bat plays a really influential role in the history of American thought in this regards. You've got your hero. He's got to step up at the moment when everything looks really bad. 4-2. Oh no, we're going to lose. And then, of course, something happens which gives Casey the opportunity to be the hero. Stepping into the box, the batter's box, he's ready to be the hero. He lets 2 pitches go by and they both are called strikes. Even though the audience is like, that can't be a strike. The energy is all there. And then the final moment, of course, of the text. Now, I want to just point out really quickly at level 3A, you can probably easily remember the last time you watched a sporting event and the pressure was mounting and the crowd was going nuts and the commentators were saying, this is it, this is it, this is the moment, this is the moment. And you could probably right now write down the last time. I'm describing it, and probably there's a moment in your mind. May have been the last time you watched the Olympics, may have been the last time you watched a professional or a college or even a high school sporting event, and you were aware there's this moment in the contest when things are either going to go one way or they're going to go the other. And let's point out how often that comes down to one person. Think about that. Many have pointed out how unfair sports is in this regards, right? So you got all these people watching. Notice at the top of page 698, you got 10,000 eyes, which means you got 5,000 people watching. You got all these people watching, right? You got all of the people who are participating in the event, the sporting event, correct? And with the exception of something like tennis, where you have one-on-one, or wrestling, where you have one-on-one, most of the time in sporting events, you have a team. A group of people with another group of people, and it all comes down to one single moment, and one person is the outcome. One way or the other. One person. Which begs a really interesting question. Is that fair to put that kind of pressure on one person? Because that one person is now got to step up and got to actually accomplish, victorious, or fail. And what is that like? In the history of American sports, you can Google this. You can actually sit down and just simply type out the tagline, worst failures in sporting history, and watch those failures unfold if you've got the opportunity to watch them on video. And without exception, every time, it always comes back to this idea right here of Casey at the bat. Now, how is the tension built? Remember, we asked you to consider that. Notice we began at the very opening lines. Look at this now on 697. I'm going to show you how this text works. Okay, watch this. It looked extremely rocky for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 2-4 with but an inning left to play. What tense? Write it down. What tense? There are 3 tenses you can write in. Past tense, present tense, future tense. It looked. What tense? Past tense, right? So write that down. The text begins in past tense. In other words, the speaker of the poem, you get a sense the speaker is one of the crowd, yes. The speaker of the poem is watching the events unfold. This is going to be a tight one. Looks like we're probably going to lose because I don't know if we're going to be able to get the runs. We're down 4-2. All of a sudden, miraculously, we've got 2 guys on base. Yes, Casey comes up. Yes, this is going to happen. This is actually going to happen. Casey is going to win it for us. Hurrah. Casey, strike 1. The crowd's ready to kill the ump. Casey gives the look to the crowd, which tells you his heroic status. Watch this. He can calm the crowd with just a look. Whoa. In other words, he's already of heroic proportions. Casey's the man. Casey will do it. Strike 2. Oh no. Because we only have 3 strikes, and that's the end of the game because we're in the final inning. But now I'm with you on 698. Right? They knew that Casey wouldn't let the ball go by again. Line 45. Look at it with me. I'm showing you how this poem creates the very tension I challenged you to consider at the beginning of our conversation. Line 45. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. Whoa, wait. What tense? What tense? Present tense. Let's pay attention. Notice how Thayer is going to shift from the past tense to the present tense. Jot down in your notes. Again, we said this, guys. Pay attention here. It's the what is it, how does it work? Okay, big deal. So he goes from the past tense to the present tense at the very moment when we're going to get the final pitch of the game. Why does he go to present tense? And many of you will argue, well, no. This is how you really can create tension, because there's an immediacy in the present tense. It puts you, the reader, you, the viewer of this text, right there in the middle of the experience. Of course, immediately, remember we define learning as the ability to connect new information to old information, right? That ability at level 3A, for example, to draw connections, to draw comparisons. And the moment we start reading this, you cannot help, if you are a viewer of any kind of sports, and it's hard not to be in American culture, you immediately can think back to the last time this happened. Everything is building. All the tension is there. And so we go to the present tense. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel vengeance his bat upon the plate. And watch the word now. It's repeated twice. And now the pitcher holds the ball. And now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. So 3 times you got the word now. In other words, what's the poet doing? Well, he's putting you in the moment. Right now. Let's watch what happens. Jot down at 3B. How many of you assumed Casey was knocking this ball out the park? How many of you assumed, dude, that is the inevitable outcome of this text, right? Like Odysseus with Polyphemus in the cave of that nasty Cyclops, Casey, like Odysseus, he's going to be the hero, right? Of course, the opposite in sport language, the opposite of the hero is the goat. The one who screws it up, right? Notice we continue. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, this is America's poem. Many have called this America's poem. In this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. Jot down in your notes at 3B. Were you shocked at all that in the end, what? We got all the way through this poem, and at the end of the poem, it's not about him ripping off a home run to be the hero of the game and win the game, but what? It's like he's struck out? That makes him a loser. This is not a poem about winners, it's a poem about a loser. How can this poem then be so popular? You would think this poem would be far more popular if he knocks the cover off the ball and hits the ball out for a home run, and he goes around, and we're all familiar in our culture, of course. Let's pay attention to this. In American culture, just like in any culture where sports are important, we always celebrate the victors, but we often forget that for every victory of the hero, there are lots of examples of guys who screw it up, who strike out, who don't win the game, right? How do you live with that experience? Well, let's jump to 2A really quickly and talk about messages here. One obvious message is we define our life in Homeric, romantic, heroic terms all the time. Of course, with the help of poets like Thayer, that's what we do, right? In other words, we have a tendency to kind of want to look at our life and the life of others in very dramatic ways, right? And of course, we're watching it here. Number 2, things don't always turn out the way you would hope. Things don't always turn out the way you would hope. We sometimes really do hope that the Casey person can win the game, can make the great accomplishment. Things don't always turn out the way we'd expect, and that's kind of sad for us, right? Why? Because we like to assume things are gonna work out. It's all gonna be okay. We're gonna have somebody that can save us. Casey is coming to save the day. Casey strikes out. Number 3, you have to keep going, because somewhere in our favored land, children are still happy and smiling, but not in Mudville. In other words, one loss is not the end of the world. One loss is just one loss. It's the way it works. But finally, Losers are often remembered as winners are often cherished. Right? Of course, it's been pointed out that the last Super Bowl, for example, it's easy to remember who won. Write down really quickly who they played. Very quickly, how the one who loses the final game can be forgotten. Let's point out the irony here in this poem. Casey is remembered in the poem Casey at the Bat because he struck out, not because he hit. In fact, many have said that if there had written a poem where Casey hits the ball out of the ballpark, the poem would not be remembered the way it's remembered today. Why? Because this poem somehow captures the human condition. Jump to 2b. Obviously, the change in tense is the one that we have already written down as phenomenal. Notice again, this is a narrative poem. It tells a little story, doesn't it? And notice how very quickly at the end of the poem, the poet kind of reaches out and grabs you and says, hey, stay with me. Predict what you think will happen next. And in your prediction, guess what? You're wrong. Although, if we wanted to take more time, we won't do this now, but if you want to, you can go back and look and ask this question. Are there any places in the poem early on where foreshadowing starts to take place and you kind of got a sense that Casey isn't going to be the hero today? He is going to be the GOAT. He's going to strike out in the pivotal moment. We all got to kind of live with that fact of that. I think you can find some of those foreshadowing renderings in the text. Let's jump to 3a really quickly. It's an obvious question. What's in your own life, can you remember the Casey moment in sport? What for you is it? Anybody that follows sport of any kind can maybe remember the moment when you expected something was going to go amazingly well for either an individual athlete or a team, and it did not work out. What's your Casey moment when you had to kind of go, well, I guess that's the ropes? And at 3b, this is a really interesting question.